Well, it's my pleasure to chair this session. We're lucky to have Jamie Lowe. Jamie is a Gunditj Mara Jabwurrung man and CEO of the National Native Title Council. He's an elected representative of the historic First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, representing the Eastern Maar people, and tasked with negotiating a treaty framework with the Victorian government. And as we heard at the start, Jamie's also currently in PBC and trusts negotiations relating to that. He has a background in both government and non-government sectors and expertise and skills in management, strategic planning, governance and economic development, and is therefore very well placed to talk to us today on the topic of Indigenous economic development, charitable trusts and the prescribed body corporate economic vehicle status. And just to frame that discussion, the National Indigenous Australians Agency released a report earlier this year, a review of the Corporations Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, and one of the key findings in that report was that there were issues with the extent to which the structures set up for Indigenous communities could engage in economic development activities. The National Native Title Council, along with Minerals Council and others, has been doing some policy work in this space for quite a number of years now. And Jamie, as well as Belinda Burbidge, who's on the call, have been heavily involved in that work. So Jamie, I'll hand over to you to talk to us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to join yourself today and all the other colleagues on the call. I'd like to start off by acknowledging country. I'm zooming in today from Wathaurong country here in sunny Geelong. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and pay particular respect to my elders, both past and present, my ancestors, and to all other First Nations people on the call today. And of course, acknowledge my other colleagues on the call today. I've also, as Ian mentioned, we're joined on the call Belinda Burbidge, Director of Policy at National Native Title Council as well. It's great to have her, and yeah, let's get into it, shall we? So as Ian called out in the intro, PBC, EVS, or Prescribed Body Corporate Economic Vehicle Status. This is a piece of work that I've been working on for, probably the best part of a decade now, and something that learned experts within the native title space has identified as a critical issue, I guess, in further in advancing native title holder rights and economic prosperity for our people. And so representatives from even Melbourne University, Professor Marcia Langton's been involved in these conversations, as Ian mentioned, people from the mineral sector, extractive sector, MCA, of course, Professor Ian Murray from UWA and others have been heavily involved in the kind of, I guess, the dialogue and constructing the kind of this model. And I guess the timely, for us to be able to also put up this model in the review of the Corporations Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, where prescribed body corporates under the Native Title Act actually fit. So let's give a little bit of a background for those of you, just to kind of give you up to speed about what a prescribed body corporate is. So under the Native Title Act 1993, native title holders, they must, once you get a determination of native title, you must then form a prescribed body corporate. Something that, I wasn't really around in the construction of the Act. I think I was still completing Year 9 studies back then. But I think from people that were around at that time was more around, well, how are we going to place this as more of an afterthought of kind of trying to construct a body that can hold the rights for those inherent rights, which have been recognised through the courts for the native title holders. So then they produced the prescribed body corporate, yeah. And I guess 30 years down the track now, we've had enough of examination take place and understanding that the PBC is not fit for purpose for a whole range of reasons. And one of those reasons is actually exercising your economic independence. PBCs have a range of obligations under various pieces of legislation, including, of course, the Native Title Act, PBC regulations in 99, of course, the Corporations Act of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or CATSI, as well as other various obligations under some other statutory obligations under federal legislation, but also within state legislation as well. It could be, around cultural heritage responsibilities, etc. as well. So there's a whole range of, obligations under statutory law or legislation, but also, of course, you have a huge cultural responsibility for the native title holders to exercise their rights through that. So the vehicle of a PBC is somewhat limited because it is that corporate body, and you kind of bat outside, above your average in a whole range of ways for, representing the mob as well. So we thought, well, how do you kind of bite off the elephant and change this? You do it one bite at a time. And so we started talking about, when a prescribed body or the native titles holders negotiate a future act with the mining company or others, and they get a payment, that payment will now, at the moment, as it is, will have to go into a charitable trust. We see that, particularly the work that we're doing, rather than understanding the First Nations of PBCs as an autonomous self-governing body, choosing their own economic development independence, principles of UNDRIP, 3, 4 and 5, which talks about, Indigenous people having the right to self-govern and determine their economic, social and cultural status. The fact that when you actually negotiate and get any money, whether it be granted from the state or other agreements that you've negotiated, has to go then to a charitable trust, and they have control and they almost have autonomy about what they do with your money. And we see that as the upside down kind of way of we would like to do things. So this is where we created the economic vehicle status, piece. And also it creates some complexity around the kind of native title holders and actually understanding, because it's kind of two separate entities. The trust is over here, the PBC is over here. So then to be able to speak to each other, there's just more, law that you need to get across and understand. And the relationship isn't always great between the trust and the PBC as well. So their communication lines can sometimes be, not great. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't. So to bring that across to the actual PBC, that actual body, so they have more autonomy through the vehicle of the PBC, through our research, would make a lot of sense. This was the EVS model was derived as we were developing Indigenous community development of the corporations model. PBCs, so in the review of the CATSI Act, there has been some discussions around creating a special section for PBCs. And also, so within that special section, there would be an opportunity to create this EVS or economic vehicle status where you'd be able to choose to go into or opt in or opt out of that particular model. Obviously you'd get tax exemptions, etc., similar to the charities model. I think that's a good enough overview, Ian. I still want to allow question time. We've only got about 6 minutes to go, so I might kind of pull up there and over to you, and if there's any questions that are arising.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, I might open it up for questions, and I know we've got a few people dialing in today who do a fair bit of work in this space. And I see, so Bridget Cowling has posed a question about native title monies being compensation and that being their tax, their historic tax treatment, and therefore they ought to be private monies. And she's raised the question about how the fact that they end up being lumped into charities, because that's the model that used to work, for tax purposes, and that was a bit of a driver. And she's asking, what are some of the fundamental problems with lumping that private compensation money into a charity law framework? And as many of the people on this Zoom know, charities are a bit of a hybrid between public and private. So suddenly starting to treat private money, give it some, or the way it's being administered, some public intersection with that and the way it's expected to be used. So I guess Bridget's question is really about private money and the problems that a charitable trust framework with its public dimensions raises for what you can do with that money.
Well, I think it almost answers the question. This is the whole reason why we're trying to create this economic vehicle status model for PBC. But I guess you're right. So it's all about autonomy and being able to do with the monies that you want to do. And so put it into the charitable model, which is actually your money, as you say, is, we work with the principle of self-determination, and putting it into the charitable model actually kind of, steps away from that rather than stepping into that. So it creates issues of people being able to kind of use their money at their own free will and invest it where they see fit. Belinda, I think, did you have something there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess also, money from compensation is compensation for the native title holders. It's not money for the PBC. It's not money to pursue economic development unless the native title holders choose to use it that way. So there needs to be people might choose to go down a charitable trust option for their compensations money, but they might not. And so there needs to be flexible structures to allow for that choice from the native title holders themselves.
I think the big issue is that there's no alternative at the moment. Yeah, so that is the alternative and we're trying to create a alternative to that model.
Yeah, look, it's a fantastic question. Thanks, Bridget, and I think those responses from Jamie and Belinda sort of highlight two issues, or I sort of drew two issues from what you were talking about. One, you get channeled into a charitable trust model, and whether that's because of historic practice, mining company expectations in negotiations, etc. There's sort of a channeling into that model. And then when the money is in the charitable trust, it must be used for charitable purposes, and you have the whole issue about public benefit versus private benefit that comes up with economic development. So some real difficult issues to try and address. And I see there's another question that's come up here about conflicts of interest. It's probably getting a little bit beyond scope. Jamie, are you happy to respond to, or Belinda, a question on conflicts of interest, how they're managed in a PBC setting where you might often have people who are related sitting on the board of the PBC and making decisions about how monies are distributed to sometimes close family members?
Well, yeah, that does present an issue. Funnily enough, just before we got on the call, I was talking about my PBC in Southwest Victoria is actually literally going through this process at the moment. And we talked about how much money we want to put in the trust, how much we don't, and to be managed by us and to be managed by the trust. And so I think that does present a challenge of conflict of interest. But I think, it's the old adage, if it's declared and managed properly, you can navigate your way through that, I think. So sound governance is something that Indigenous communities have been practicing for forever. And I think stepping into this space and that we need to kind of, I think it can be navigated, the conflict of interest as it gets navigated at the moment. So it is a tricky thing. There's no doubt about that, but it does you're already managing money through the PBC anyway. So there's always going to be a standing conflict of interest, related party transactions, etc. It's a real thing that, we're managing on a day-to-day basis because it's such a tight-knit community.
Yeah, it's also, that's a question about governance, and there are often publicised issues with governance in PBCs, often not the good governance that we see, unfortunately. But, this is also a question about resourcing PBCs properly as well, which is another area of work the NNTC works in, because yeah, there needs to be a focus on economic development, which is not charity, it's First Nations economic development, and then there's the governance, and that's the two sides of, you know, any sort of nation building or nation rebuilding approach, and both of those need to be resourced properly as well.
Thanks, Belinda, and thanks, Jamie. Well, I'm thinking, given timing, perhaps we might wrap up there, unless there are any other questions that people have.
I think I just wanted to build on something. I know I'm going to run into time a little bit, but just on the governance question. So we make a direct comparison with native title holding bodies, PBCs, to local government, and they practice in the same way in many different areas. So when you're making decisions as a local government, of course, you're a citizen or a resident of the community in which you're making decisions on, and there's always conflicts. You know, you've got interests, your own interests, and whether it be monetary interests or other kind of personal interests. And it just gets managed. And I know that a lot of the time the governance issue gets raised within the Indigenous space. It becomes a little bit frustrating to having to continually answer that when we've already got these formal structures where, you know, the issue of governance doesn't get raised. It just is what it is. So I think maturing into that space and knowing that all these conflicts or whatever else it may be can be managed within a mature governance system. I think that we get to that space and then we just start talking about the next step.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I mean, it's a great point. Think about all the conflicts of interest that arise in any company or, you know, any sort of formal governance setting that you have. So, look, given time, we might leave it there, but just like to thank Jamie and Belinda both very much indeed for bringing a bit more insight into this issue about Indigenous charitable trusts, the PBC economic vehicle status as one potential policy solution to some of those issues. They're ongoing issues. They've been there for a while. There's a lot of work that's been done, but there's still more to do to help, I guess, try and make sure that money can actually be used for what the Indigenous communities who are the rightful recipients of that money wish to use it for, without, you know, unnecessary regulation or other things coming in and impeding the use of those funds. So, Jamie and Belinda, thank you both very much for joining us and talking to us today.
Thank you.